Okay. Um, so welcome. We are delighted to have you here. My name is Bailey. This book club is co-organized by myself, Dr. Bailey Harrington, the Editorial Freelancers Association co-chair, and my colleague Letitia Henville, the Editors Canada co-chair, who's unable to be here today. Another colleague, Emma Calabresi, is filling in for her.
Hi.
We're running this event as part of the Joint Association Academic Editing Group. And if you would like to volunteer to help us with our work, please visit the Academic Editing Chapter website. Emma is going to put the link into the chat for us. Today, our book club host is going to be Bessie Goldberg. Bessie is a freelance line and developmental editor who works with scholars in the humanities and qualitative social sciences, and a writing coach who works with writers who want to improve their craft and their relationship with writing. Bessie, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thanks so much, Bailey and Emma. I'm delighted to be able to introduce the authors of the Dissertation to Book Workbook today. It's an amazing resource for writers and for editors. Katelyn Knox is an associate professor of French and the associate director of the School of Language and Literature at the University of Central Arkansas. She's the co-author of the Dissertation to Book Workbook from University of Chicago Press in 2023. And the author of Race on Display in 20th and 21st Century France, which was from Liverpool Press, published in 2016. And Allison van Deventer is the other half of the Dissertation to Book Workbook team. She's a freelance editor who specializes in developmental editing for books in the humanities and interpretive social sciences. It's so great to have you here today. And I'd like to tell everyone in the room, if you have questions that you already are dying to ask, you can pop them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can call on you and you can ask them yourselves, whichever you prefer. I'm just going to start us off with a couple of questions. First of all, it's such a pleasure to read a book that so clearly comes out of extensive experience with real people. And I wanted to ask how you started to think about your experiences as editors and writing mentors as something that could be turned into this book, and what that process looked like.
Sure, I can start us off there, but really the workbook itself and the let's say online curriculum that was its forebear emerged out of my own process of trying to turn my own dissertation into a book, and really feeling like I got a lot of big picture information about book voice and book argument and things like that, but was really struggling with the nitty-gritty details of how to operationalize that in my own writing process. And I felt like in my own case, peer review was a really important milestone where I actually saw concretely how folks were evaluating my manuscript and what it needed to do. And after my first monograph was published, I really wanted to share what I had learned with other authors, especially through the peer review process and some of the tips and activities that had helped me revise my manuscript post peer review. And so I started doing that very soon after I brought on Allison, and we ran several summer cohorts of basically live 4-day boot camps that worked through similar exercises. And the curriculum that developed evolved over the 3 or 4 years that we ran it in real time. We transformed it into a self-paced curriculum. And then one of at least my ultimate goals was to really make the exercises as widely accessible as possible. And so at that point, we realized that working with a university press or a publisher could help us make the materials more widely accessible.
And as we ran this live boot camp, we were always talking about how to make things better. We would have these long Zoom calls where we would talk about what the authors had produced in their written materials and think, okay, so why did this isn't quite right. Why did they do it this way? How did they interpret what we said? What could we say to get them to to think about their book more in the ways that we're thinking about it? And so we went through a couple of major revisions of this online program, and then we decided to turn it into a workbook. And the nice thing was that at that point we were revising it for publication as a book rather than writing it from scratch, although we did actually end up writing some chapters from scratch. And we added another chapter, at least one chapter after peer review, I think. Oops, Katelyn, right? But yes, so it was this constant process of thinking about how authors responded to our feedback and how we could tweak what we said to them in order to help them do better. Which is something that I actually aspire to do more of in my practice as an editor. I think that I need to do a better job of keeping track of what I tell authors that seems to resonate and seems to work. And what tends to produce confusion or what generates things that are a little bit more off base.
Great, thank you. I mean, on that same note, I guess I wanted to ask more about how this workbook relates to your work as editors and writing mentors, and how kind of you see guiding people to do the revisions themselves versus doing a developmental edit and letting the author take that away, just how it fits in with your practices as editors.
All right, I'll start with that one. So first of all, the book is divided essentially into two parts, and most of the book is devoted to doing deep thinking about your book as a whole and about the chapters, how the chapters interact with the book as a whole. So this is chapters 1 through 13 of the workbook. Chapters 14 and 15 then outline a method for actually getting into the chapters and revising them. And then chapter 16, which is a bit of an outlier, is about revising for voice. So when authors are working with the chapter 1 through 3 piece, they're really doing this deep thinking. And so that is clearly something that they can do by themselves with the workbook. It's written to give a structured way to think about your book. And really the way I was thinking about this workbook as we developed it is I wanted to teach authors to think about their books in the same way that I would if I were looking at if someone handed me a manuscript and I'm going to think about the way the chapters develop the main idea. I'm going to think about what the argument is. I'm going to think about how the various strands of the argument relate to each other or build on each other. So the exercises are developed to help authors do that thinking themselves. Now, if an author doesn't want to use our workbook or for any reason, which is completely fine, and if they hand me their manuscript, then I am, of course, going to be doing some of that deep thinking by myself. And I have my own mental shortcuts. There are things that I focus on. The book heavily features what we call book questions and chapter answers as a way to manage the relationship between the book's argument and its chapters. And so sometimes I'll come up with my own little draft set of book questions for an author, even if they haven't thought of their own. And that helps me keep track of what the book is doing and what the chapters are supposed to be doing. It's also very useful when an author wants me to work on one chapter of an academic book. This is a situation that I find myself in pretty often as a developmental editor, even though I know a lot of developmental editors only work with a complete manuscript, but I wind up with a lot of clients who say, help me, here's a chapter. And so I strongly encourage them to develop book questions so we can track what's going on between the chapter and the whole book. But if they don't do it, then I might quickly come up with my own in my own mind. But in terms of working with authors, what I really love is to be able to do the deep thinking with the author alongside them. And so sometimes I have worked with clients who are working through the workbook, or we had some beta testers before we actually got it published. So they would do one chapter and then set up a Zoom meeting with me and we would talk about it. Or they would check in with me at particular points in the manuscript, say after chapter 3, after chapter 8, after chapter 13. And we would talk about what they would produce. I would give them feedback. So that's a way of doing this deep thinking. And also sometimes I'll just get on a Zoom call with an author and lead them through some of this deep thinking, especially with the book questions and chapter answers and the organizing principle. And we just talk through it. It's a way of doing a very speedy shortcut to the thinking of the book as a whole. So that's my long answer. I like it when authors can do this thinking on their own. I am willing to do it alone on my end if all I have to work with is the manuscript. But my favorite is when I can do this thinking alongside the authors and with them.
Yeah, and I can jump in there. So I would not classify myself as a developmental editor per se. I'm more of a mentor coach. But then Allison and I together coach cohorts through the workbook as it exists now. And I wholeheartedly agree with Allison. It's so rewarding when you are able to work with authors directly and help them talk through their ideas in real time. We also run some workshops, and typically those kind of shortcut or give authors a glimpse into some of the core ideas at the heart of the workbook. So book questions and chapter answers, and organizing principle. The workbook then gives a lot more detail, examples, step-by-step exercises, etc. One of the key features of the workbook might be that each chapter starts with a what to expect section and some key stumbling blocks or obstacles for authors. So that really that's kind of our way of trying to be an actual coach, even in the asynchronous format of a workbook, and help authors know what to expect as they're going through the exercises. And then each chapter concludes with a debrief and troubleshooting piece. So that again is our experience of, if you were in front of us live and you had this particular problem, here's how we'd coach you to find a solution or continue with your momentum. And then I think one of the other pieces that relates more to my mentorship / coach side of things is a lot of authors have said, and cohort members before them have said, this material is so helpful because it's all laid out for me in a step-by-step format. All I have to do is sit down and do the exercises. I don't have to figure out what I'm supposed to be doing to begin with. So for those of you who might do coaching in addition to editing, it can be helpful to translate that for your clients as well. This idea of, okay, the workbook has all of these exercises and prompts, etc., set up for you, and that's a helpful scaffold. When you kind of take those training wheels off, it's important to, or now you can see the benefits of setting very concrete, specific goals for your writing sessions or those types of things.
Amazing. I would love to be in one of those boot camps and see how things go. But it reminds me of another question that I wanted to ask. And again, people in the room, feel free to raise your Zoom hand with questions or pop them in the chat. But I was curious if you find, I mean, first of all, I love that format that you have of like anticipating problems and also results. And I also just want to thank you for normalizing the combination of technical writing problems that are being solved and also psychological things that come up, because I think it's there for all of us, and just to talk about it matter-of-factly as something to think about and address is really refreshing and wonderful. But I was wondering if there are places, I mean, I can kind of see it in the workbook, but places where you got a lot of pushback from people or where there was more resistance to particular exercises or ways of thinking about their material or things like that.
That's a good one. The first thing that comes to mind is that when we ask people to write a book question, which is a key part of the workbook, it's in chapter 3, and it's really the one of the most important steps. People, scholars, especially in the humanities, tend to want to write something very big. Like, how does literature racialize people? And because, your book has to be significant, right? It has to answer an important question. It has to answer a question maybe that makes a difference in the real world. And, that's the question that I really want my book to answer. But we always have to try to guide them back to something that is simpler and more concrete. And as part of that, we often have to convince them that their actual sources, their corpus, their body of evidence, whatever it is important. You can ask a question about these specific sources that is really interesting, and the answers are going to be fascinating too. The sources deserve that. They're worthy of attention, and the questions you ask about them matter. And so we have to guide people back from these big questions, which do have their place. Books ask and answer these big significant questions too. But for the purposes of thinking about your book in the way that we describe in this workshop, we guide authors back to writing questions that are simple and specific and about the actual evidence and nothing beyond that evidence we have at hand. And that usually takes some mental work to get the authors there.
I wholeheartedly agree with what Allison just shared. And in fact, that directly relates to the workshop session that we had this morning, where authors tend to get really scared or anxious if their book questions are very simple and direct. And so we often have to coach them through, no, your book will do many more interesting and important things than just answer this. What avatars did authors use to represent the zombie in Caribbean fiction, for instance? But laying that out as a book question, as a tool to manage your argumentative strands, or for the purposes of that, your book question is absolutely perfect. It needs to be simple. Tools are most useful when they're simple. I think actually the other thing that comes to mind, Bessie, when we're thinking about pushback is not necessarily anything inside of the book itself, but rather a larger question around the genre or format one should use to do this big picture thinking. And it's a question Allison and I get regularly around, well, I need to write my book proposal first so that I can see the big picture, and so that then I can revise my 2 chapters and send it to publishers, or I need to write the proposal first to know what I'm talking about. Or alternatively, and more rarely, I need to write the full book manuscript first to see what I'm talking about. And in our framework, the dissertation to book workbook actually guides you to do a lot of the big picture thinking that you do in the proposal, just absent the proposal genre, which in and of itself can be tricky for authors. And so it's really the book proposal, the dissertation to book workbook really helps authors clarify their argument and make sure that each chapter is carrying that argument or those argumentative strands forward without actually using the language of argument, which at least in my particular case, I was like a deer in headlights when I was at the dissertation to book transition, because I knew my book had to have an argument. I was I had this existential dread that my book didn't have an argument, would never have an argument. How do you actually produce an argument? Do you just sit down and write, in my book, I argue, ... And I was kind of getting caught up in, is this a chapter argument? Is this actually a book argument? Is the book argument just what emerges when all my chapters come together, etc.? And so a lot of authors have those exact same anxieties. And we think that the dissertation to book workbook helps them in the same way that they think a proposal is going to help them, but with much more probing, prodding, asking, what if I organized my book differently? What if I ordered my chapters differently? What if I centered the actors instead of the abstract concept, etc.? And they don't have to sound confident or write in the same genre as they do in a book proposal.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I can see how it'd be very reassuring also to have that approach. The book, it can all be very stressful, and having specific techniques always makes it less stressful. I was curious also about whether writing this book and working with the boot camps has changed the way you work with individual clients or students.
Yeah, it's definitely changed it for me. And I could talk for a long time about all the ways that it's changed what I do. But two of the major areas are in the way I work on and talk about structure and the way I work on and talk about argument. So to begin with argument, of course, we all know that in an academic book, the argument is really important. But as Katelyn was saying, there's all this anxiety about it, and it's really hard to just sit down and produce one. And what actually is an argument anyway, right? Is the argument sort of like the big picture lesson that other scholars can take away from your book and apply to their research? Or is it like something, is it the sum of the chapter arguments, or is it something else? And so this experience of developing this workbook led me to de-emphasize the argument as part of the process. And instead, I focus on these book questions, which can really do the heavy lifting of identifying the book's core priorities and sort of pointing to what the book as a whole will be saying about them. And then the answers to those questions for each chapter outline the work that each chapter is doing to advance the argument. So instead of badgering my authors and dealing with their emotions around the argument, I just say, let's work with questions first, and the argument will sort itself out later. But the other important thing that I've come to settle on as an editor in terms of argument is a definition of the book argument as being about the book's specific body of evidence. So I don't define an argument as being the claim about the significance. I understand that other people may define it in different ways, but this is just my working definition that I use for myself. So the claim about the books that the book makes about its own particular sources. And again, because I think those sources are important and interesting, and the things that scholars have to say about them really matter. And so thinking this way helps me distinguish between argument and claims for significance. And I could talk about those things as separate things with authors. And in the case that a book proposal or a book introduction or even a chapter is missing an actual argument about its sources, I can identify that, I can pinpoint where it goes and help the author come up with something, some claim to make about those sources. And second, this experience of developing this workbook has given me a way of thinking about structure that I've found really helpful. So one of the things that we talk about in the workbook, it's in chapter 2, is something that we call organizing principle, which is the logic that organizes the chapters. And you would pinpoint it if you completed the sentence, each chapter discusses a different blank, a different archetype, a different trope, a different author, a different group of filmmakers, a different a group of adolescents, so on and so forth. Clearly, I always have to say not all books are organized with such a clear logic, but if you're trying to improve a book's organization, this is a very decent place to start. So thinking this way gives me an entry point into talking with authors about how their chapters are organized, and gives us a way to think about decisions that, especially if the book began as a dissertation, that they may not have realized that they were making when they were writing that dissertation. They just sort of like did things because it seemed obvious. But now, as they're writing a book, they could make other choices, and it's important to think about those. And this way of thinking about structure as this existence of an organizing principle also really helps me when I'm evaluating a chapter too, because when I encounter a chapter that just seems all over the place, I read it and I'd say like, what did I just read? What was that exactly? Or even a chapter that seems to make sense from sentence to sentence, but it ends up in a totally different place from where it began. I use this idea of an organizing principle applied to the sections. So I might look at the chapter's main body sections and I say, okay, so what are they doing? Each section discusses a different blank. And a lot of the time, there is no organizing logic behind them. And, that can be fine. You can have a good chapter that is not tightly organized like that. But if you're trying to diagnose a chapter's problems, I found that it can be really useful to figure out what the chapter wants to be doing, what it could be doing. Oh yes, each section discusses a different formal device. Each section could discuss a different author. I had an author with a chapter that had like 9 different sections, and 4 of them were about the same author, and we brought it under control, and it was no longer 20,000 words long. But she had 3 solid sections, and each one discussed a different author, and all of a sudden it's easier to grasp. So this language of organizing principle it's given me a shared language to use with authors, and also a very helpful way of thinking that I can use even if the author in question doesn't know anything about our book.
A time check, it's about 10:30.
And I would echo what Allison said and say that the principles behind the workbook. So I don't necessarily coach book authors or read their material, but I coach undergraduate students in producing arguments about texts. And the core tenets at the heart of the workbook around alignment between structure, argument, and evidence really guide or inform how I guide my own students in producing their argument-driven pieces. I think this might be related as well to Matthew's question. If I could, am I allowed to share my screen? Do you know?
You should be able to, I think.
Okay,
If you
I didn't
can't,
try.
let me know and I can try to fix it.
Nope, I didn't try yet. That's not right. Okay. Yes, we'll do this. So Matthew asked about a quick example of a question that's too broad versus one that's more specific. So these are some slides that we use to present the concept of a central book question. And I think this ties back to the alignment between argument, evidence, and structure that has informed how I coach my own students. So I'll go through this really quickly, but book questions are simple. They're about evidence. And then book questions and chapter answers help manage the book's argumentative strands over the course of the book. But this is what Allison was getting at a little bit earlier, these not book questions, because we think that they're actually more about significance than they are about the body of evidence that the authors are going to be studying. So how do social movements transform identity? That's absolutely something that a book can and should ask, but it's not something that you can actually answer in a different way in each chapter. So it's more like each chapter is going to answer this by saying, and that's how social movements transform identity, and that's how social movements transform identity, etc. And that would be pretty boring. Or what happens when history is divorced from the nation? This is actually a book, but it's not the book's argument, it's more of the significance. So this is a book considering what happens when we divorce history from the nation. But we need to read all of the chapters in order to understand fully what happens when history is divorced from the nation. Instead, sorry, pretend that this is not a blanket slide. This first question up here, how did Minjung theologians influence Korean theology, for instance? That is a question that you can ask and answer with variations in each chapter. Or what we point out in our workshops, your structure, your organizing principle is intimately tied to the argument that emerges over your chapters. So if you have a chronological organizing principle, so on this slide we have time period, that necessarily implies a question such as, how did conceptions of family change over time? So each chapter explores a different time period. The book as a whole is invested in looking at how did this conception of family in, for instance, Francophone West African novels, how did conceptions of family change over time? If the book is organized slightly differently, though, and each chapter explores a different author, then that implies a different main book question, which is, how do different Francophone West African authors theorize the family? Or if we look at a different geographical context, so each chapter explores a different country or different national literature, different regional literature, different ethnic literature, etc. How does this particular geography or zone influence or inform conceptions of identity in West African literature? Or if each one explores a different theme, that implies a different book question, which is something like, what are the different themes through which authors theorize the family? So here we're not asking something like, what is the relationship between literature and family writ large, which would be more of a significance question. Instead, we're asking about very specific corpuses of evidence, and this helps us see the relationship between both evidence and argument, and also structure and the argumentative strands that will be at the fore.
And I can contribute another quick example of a big picture question and then a set of more specific questions. And these are based on a client's questions, but they're heavily anonymized. So maybe the big picture question is, why did the national reconstruction process fail? Which, okay, that's actually a pretty good question. And the book as a whole is going to answer this, but the client is not going to give a different answer in every chapter. The book is giving one answer. You don't have the chapter 1 reason, the chapter 2 reason, the chapter 3 reason. So a more specific question is, what strategies did the government of X country use to manage water use? And maybe a second question would be, and how did the people respond? And when you hear these, you can guess that the book is going to be making some argument about how let's imagine that there was kind of a mess over water policies and water use that caused the national reconstruction process to fail, right? So those specific questions that can be answered directly with the evidence are what we call book questions. And we have a ton of good questions coming up in the chat, I see. That was one. Let's see, should we go in order to answer these questions? Then we have a question that says, how did you first recruit PhDs and authors for your 4-day boot camp and then the online course? Let's see, Katelyn, that's really a question that belongs to you.
Yeah, so originally I just advertised it on my website, and recruited through colleagues. So I know Allison, for instance, when recruits through her editing clients as well. So originally I posted it on my website, and to my surprise, someone actually that I didn't know actually signed up for it. But heavily recruited through colleagues and colleagues of colleagues, at least initially. Over time, it morphed into a curriculum housed on the platform Teachable, which I really like. And it ended up within Teachable, it was set up as a course. And it had its own landing page that people could just pay and get direct access to the self-paced version. Or when we ran facilitated cohorts, we still had students work inside of the Teachable course to get the material, but then we would host Zoom sessions.
Right. Yeah. And we advertise on social media now. And we have an interest list. People can sign up to be notified about upcoming workshops. So there's that. We're still figuring it out. And I'd like to come back to the question about whether it's challenging to coach multiple writers who are at different stages, because yes, it's challenging. Let's come back to that one, because I really want to make sure that we get to Ellen's question about books with a part 1, part 2 structure, which is a really great question. And we were planning to talk about it anyway. So the question is, how would we adapt this advice for books that have 2-part structures? Because the method outlined in the book is that you have a set of 2 or 3 book questions, and then every chapter answers each of those questions. It's a way of managing the relationship between the part and the whole. So what happens when books have a part 1 and part 2? And so here, our answer is that it makes the most sense, we think, to have one set of book questions for part 1 and one set of book questions for part 2. Because the whole idea of having parts, as I see it, is that the 2 parts of the book are not, they're sort of their own sub thing within the book. So in the original format in the workbook with the book question and chapter answers, you're making sure that all of the chapters work together in roughly parallel ways within the book. But as soon as you introduce a part structure, the chapters are across the 2 parts are not working in parallel ways. That's the point of having parts. So you could have maybe 2 book questions for part 1, and the chapters within that part would answer those questions. And then another 2 questions for part 2, and those chapters would answer those. And so the chapters within each part are aligned, and they're all building a sort of sub-argument, a part-level argument that's cohesive, but the chapters don't have to align with each other across parts, because that's the point of having parts, right? In the same way that if you have one chapter and another chapter, and each chapter has sections, you don't need the sections to speak to each other across the chapters, right? Because they're within their own containers. And so and each in the part of a book, when a book has 2 parts, maybe each part has its own organizing principle too. And I would say then that in the book's argument, the author will have to do some work to make sure that, of course, the 2 parts seem like part of a cohesive whole. Otherwise, why not just have 2 books, right? But that's work that the author can definitely do within the introduction, showing how maybe one lays the groundwork for the other or something like that. So yeah, so I would just say, think about the book questions and chapter answers as managing the relationship between the whole and the parts. And using that conceptualization, you could apply that in different ways. You could apply it to a chapter if the chapter is the whole and the sections are the parts, or you could apply it to parts of the book, parts being the whole and the chapters being the parts.
I think I saw a question come in that I would definitely like to pick up on, if that's okay. This is from Kathleen Vasek, probably, maybe. And you say, I primarily coach doctoral students. My initial sense is that the exercises would be quite useful for them as well. What are key distinctions you see between using these exercises for doctoral students versus DIS to book authors? Would you caution against using them for students? I think this is a little bit my answer might be a little bit complicated, but I think the core ideas at the heart of the workbook are absolutely very useful for graduate student authors. And thinking about things like, oh, how am I going to structure this journal article? How am I going to structure this seminar paper? What is my argument? And is it actually well suited for the structure that I've picked? Or some of the questions that we ask in chapters 6 through 8, which are all about chapters, their cohesiveness, and then the narrative arc could work really well for seminar papers or journal articles. For instance, one of the questions that we ask authors to grapple with is why this set of whatever, why this corpus and not other texts or not other cases I could have considered. I think thinking through those types of questions in a limited way in graduate school is absolutely beneficial for authors. The one thing that I would caution you all who advise graduate students around is actually using the workbook while the dissertation authors are working on their dissertation, because in many ways, in at least how we understand dissertations, both of us wrote dissertations, it starts with an idea and a vague plan, and you produce it, at least in my experience, chapter by chapter. And in the way that we like to talk about dissertations, those are really kind of the first working through of ideas and your first test about what your evidence is actually going to be able to support. And you really aren't able to do many of the distilling exercises like book questions and chapter answers until you have a lot more knowledge and confidence around what arguments your evidence is actually going to be able to support. One of the other things too is that we think it would be, and we don't do this with book authors either, it would be almost paralyzing to ask prospective dissertation authors to do the whole workbook before they've written the dissertation, because they just don't know enough about their evidence yet. They haven't worked through it. When we do the dissertation to book workshops as well, we work with authors who start with a dissertation or a pile of draft material, such that they actually have the confidence to say, yes, this is what I'll be able to show in this chapter, or no, this chapter really doesn't have the evidence, or the type of evidence that I have doesn't actually allow me to show that particular thing. So I think the general gist is the tools are absolutely useful for helping graduate students learn to think about academic writing and argumentative academic writing, but please, please, please don't put the workbook in their hands and say, do this before you write your dissertation, because that would be paralyzing and unproductive.
Okay, and so there's a really great question here about what to tell authors about how much overlap there can be between their dissertation and a monograph based on that dissertation. So how similar is too similar? I'd love to see discussion about this in the comments if you guys want to talk among yourselves, because I imagine this is something that a lot of editors have experience with discussing with authors, and you probably have a lot of very good advice there too. So I'd love to see that. I would say that I don't let myself be pinned down to giving a percentage that has to be different. The difference is a core difference is in the genre of the book versus the genre of the dissertation. So a dissertation is usually written chapter by chapter, and used to show that you belong to the scholarly community because you have acquired the knowledge and the skills and done the research that you need to, are necessary to join this community. A book, on the other hand, is organized around a strong central argument. It needs to be very clearly focused on that argument, and each chapter needs to move that argument forward. And in writing a book, there are a lot of decisions that need to be thought through, and they might be decisions made about the same material that you used in the dissertation, about the chapter organization and the choice of sources and the order of the chapters and what the argument is. But because a lot of dissertation writers make these decisions on the fly as they're researching, they might not, the decisions may no longer be serving the book. So when you write a book, it's important to actually think through all of these aspects: the organization of the book, the order of the chapters, what the argument is, how the chapters relate to the book, and to make those decisions on purpose. And so the book may end up looking very much like the decision, but the authors need to recognize the reasons behind the choices that they've made and be able to explain them in the book proposal. Another way of thinking about this is that the dissertation often contains a lot of really excellent analyses of primary sources, and quite a lot of those analyses may be able to go directly into the book. They may end up being revised and tweaked, but the book's framing and argumentation will likely need considerable revision. So the good news for authors is that they don't have to reanalyze their sources from scratch, or heaven forbid, go find a whole other set of sources. They may need to add some things here and there and tweak the framing, but often quite a lot of the dissertation is usable in the book. But there is typically quite a lot of work that has to be done around the introductions of the chapters, the conclusions of the chapters, the organization of the chapter sections, the book introduction, and the book conclusion, even if you're working from a very strong dissertation.
And thank you, Matthew, for the comment. I think we would wholeheartedly agree with this idea of the authorial perspective being a main difference between dissertation and book. And there I would just point out chapter 16 of the Dissertation to Book Workbook, which presents what we call the tour guide model, which is helping authors think about themselves as an intellectual tour guide and their readers as interested tour participants, and how that changes how they approach citing secondary sources, rather than the dissertation ease that they might start off with.
We've got about 5 minutes before we need to wrap up. I think there are 2 questions left.
I can take Ellen's about effectively, are there any times when okay, so we provide time estimates for the exercises in each chapter, and then if authors work in workshops with us or directly with Allison or something, is it ever the case that authors spend less time than advertised in the workbook? And I would say yes. And I would say if authors need to spend less time than, say, 3 hours, and 3 hours is advertised around chapter 2 of the workbook, then that's totally fine. I think typically Allison ends up working with authors with something she calls a book audit, and she shortcuts chapters 3 through 5 and 9 and 10, doing those, a very limited version of those, but still getting folks on the right track, in 2 hours rather than in dozens of hours that we allot for it in the workbook. So it's absolutely possible to work through things more quickly when you're working with an editor or a coach.
let's see. And a follow-up question here. So won't publishers reject a monograph if the content is essentially the same as a dissertation? I mean, a dissertation is a recognizable thing. And I think that experienced editors can recognize a dissertation, an unrevised dissertation, when they see it. And will probably reject it. But if it's been revised to be a book that's organized around a strong central argument and has lost this dissertationese, then it's not going to be automatically rejected, even if the analyses look essentially the same. And I don't think that the editors are going to go back and download the dissertation from ProQuest and compare how much is the same as the manuscript. I've never heard of that being done at all.
Yeah,
And
I've heard of basically dissertations being available on ProQuest as an anxiety around my book needs to be a certain percentage different. And in my limited experience talking with acquisitions editors and researching that topic, I've absolutely found it to not be the case. Even if the full dissertation is available on ProQuest, like Allison said, they're not going and trying to make sure that a certain percentage is different. It's really about authorial voice, argument, convincing case studies, deploying secondary sources, etc.
oh, and Ellen had a question about time estimates for the exercises in each chapter. So yes, if someone is working with an editor, then they can leapfrog over some of the time that it takes to complete, especially chapters 3 through 5 and chapters 9 through 10. And in particular, if someone is getting feedback from an editor, they may be able to skip chapters 5 and 10, which we really wrote to sort of reproduce the thinking that we do when we're giving feedback on people's book questions and chapter answers. And Bessie, is there anything else that we should be talking about in the 1 minute we have left?
If you have any final thoughts, that's great. But these are great questions. And we have the idea about coaching, the question about coaching multiple writers in different stages that we can come back to if you have something to say about that.
Right. It's hard to know what to say about that because yes, it is challenging. If we have them signed up for in one of our workshops that we run, it is not it's relatively straightforward because they're working through material that we assign to them. In the one that we're currently running, they're working through the workbook, so we just tell them what chapters to do, and it's not terribly different if they're working in different fields with different ideas. That's pretty manageable for us. And as an editor, working with my own private clients, yes, it is difficult sometimes to be juggling all these authors at different stages, but authors have very different challenges anyway. And if you're the type of editor like I am, who has a lot of clients going at any one time, as opposed to working on a single manuscript for a month and then taking a new one, authors are all different anyway, so the types of difference is just something that I've learned how to manage.
Okay. So I'm gonna need to start doing wrap-up stuff now. But on behalf of the EFA and Editors Canada, Bessie, thank you so much for hosting this conversation today. And thank you to Allison and Katelyn for coming to talk about your book. This was a great discussion. So some like kind of book club admin stuff. Our next meeting will be in April. We will be discussing Every Day I Write the Book by Amitabha Kumar. Dr. Kumar is the Helen D. Lockwood Professor of English at Vassar College, and he'll be joining us for a Q&A on his essays about the writing process and in his perceptive and witty observations on the academic world. Every Day I Write the Book is a part writing guide, part manifesto, and very different from many of the other books that we've read in this book club. So as always, we will ask you to RSVP so that we can send you the Zoom link and the questions for discussion. Emma's popping the link to the book, a discount code from the University Press, and the RSVP link into the chat now, if you would like to go ahead and register. And then in June, we will be hosting the co-editors of The Art of Academic Editing, a guide for authors and editors. This has been put together by Doctors Kara Jordan and Leslie Castro Woodhouse, who I believe I saw in the participant list earlier. But this book explains the nuts and bolts of 8 different editors' academic editing practices using real-life models, sharing their tips and advice for both scholarly writers and editors. So the RSVP details for the April and June book clubs will be announced through the Academic Editing Chapter Newsletters email list, which we encourage you to sign up for by going to the EFA Academic Editing Chapters page. Emma is also putting that in the chat now. Yes. So the link for the June book club book is also in the chat if you scroll up. And then our newsletter is the best way to learn about upcoming events and opportunities to be involved. This book club is just one small part of what the chapter does. And that's all the admin that I have to share right now. So thank you for joining us. I hope to see you at other events later this year. If there are any questions about upcoming things, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but you can feel free to ask those.